The dust motes danced in the slanting afternoon light of the studio, each a tiny, gilded world. Elisabetta Morelli watched them, her brush hovering over the prepared oak panel. The air was thick with the smells of linseed oil, turpentine, and the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. This was her sanctuary, a space she had carved out for herself in a world that believed a woman's hands were meant for needlework, not for mixing the profound darkness of a shadow or capturing the fleeting light of a soul. She was working on a small, private piece, a study of Mary Magdalene, not as the penitent sinner, but as the woman who first witnessed the resurrection. Her Magdalene had work-roughened hands and eyes that held a storm of grief and dawning, impossible hope. It was a radical interpretation, one she would likely never show publicly, but it was a vision that demanded release from her fingertips. A sharp rap on the heavy oak door broke her concentration. Her patron, the wealthy and perpetually anxious silk merchant, Signor Lombardi, entered without waiting for a reply. His round face was flushed, his fingers plucking nervously at the rich velvet of his doublet. "Elisabetta, you must put that away. At once." He gestured vaguely at the Magdalene. "A commission has arrived. The most important of your career. Of my career as your patron." Elisabetta carefully laid her brush down on the porcelain rest. "Signor Lombardi, please catch your breath. What commission could possibly require such haste?" "It is from the Signoria," he whispered, as if the name itself held sacred power. "For the council itself. They wish to commemorate the new understanding. The contract with the condottiere Valerio Orsini." The name landed in the quiet room like a stone in a still pond. Valerio Orsini, the wolf of the Apennines, a man whose name was spoken in taverns with a mixture of awe and fear. A mercenary captain of such ruthless efficiency that the Republic of Florence had decided it was cheaper to hire him and his private army for a year of peacekeeping than to risk him being hired by their rivals in Siena or Pisa. They were buying his loyalty, and now, it seemed, they wanted to buy his portrait. "They want a portrait," Lombardi confirmed, his voice trembling with excitement. "A grand one, to hang in the Palazzo Vecchio, a reminder of the strength Florence commands. And they want you to paint it." Elisabetta felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "Me? Why? There are a dozen masters, Bronzino, Pontormo, who would leap at such an opportunity." "Because," Lombardi said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "Orsini is a brute, but he is not a fool. He knows the Florentine masters. He knows they will paint him as they see him. A necessary evil, a hired blade. He wants a fresh perspective, someone untainted by the politics of the court. And your Magdalene from last year's guild exhibition, someone showed it to him. He said she looked like she could stare down the devil. He wants that same unflinching I turned on him." The irony was not lost on her. Her attempt to show a woman's inner strength had attracted the attention of a man whose profession was the external application of force. It was a perilous tightrope. To please the Signoria, she would have to flatter him. To please Orsini, she would have to be honest. To please herself, she wasn't sure what that would require. "When do I meet him?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Now," a new voice said from the doorway. A man stood there, framed by the dark wood. He had entered so silently, she hadn't heard a thing. He was not the hulking giant of tavern tales, but he was tall and built with a lean, corded strength that his fine clothes, a dark, embroidered doublet, and a simple white shirt could not conceal. His hair was black and longer than the current fashion, swept back from a high forehead. But it was his face that held her. It was a landscape of calculated calm, yet weathered by sun and violence. A thin, pale scar bisected his left eyebrow, a flaw that somehow perfected the whole. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that stripped the room of all its familiar comforts. "I prefer to assess a battlefield before I commit my forces," Valerio Orsini said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. His gaze swept the studio, taking in the canvases, the jars of pigment, the half-finished Magdalene. Those gray eyes lingered on the painting for a moment longer than the rest. Senior Lombardi practically genuflected. Captain Orsini, an honor. This is the artist, Elisabetta Morelli. I see that, Orsini said, his eyes returning to her. They held no warmth, but no outright hostility either. It was the appraising look of a man assessing a new piece of equipment. You are young, and you are direct, Elisabetta replied, finding her spine. She would not be cowed in her own studio. My age has no bearing on my skill. My hand is steady, and my eye is true. A ghost of a smile, there and gone, touched his lips. So I've been told. The Signoria wishes for a portrait to inspire confidence in our arrangement. I wish for a portrait that is true. Can you reconcile those two demands, Mistress Morelli? The challenge was laid bare. He was not asking for a flattering lie, but for a representation of power so authentic it would silence any doubters. He wanted to be seen, truly seen, and have that vision legitimized by paint and panel. I can only paint what is before me, Captain, she said, meeting his gaze squarely. The truth has many facets. It is a matter of which one the light catches. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of interest, sharp and keen. Then let us begin. Where do you wish me? The session that followed was a silent battle of wills. She positioned him by the north-facing window, where the light was soft and constant. She instructed him to stand, one hand resting on the pommel of his sheathed sword. She set up her easel, prepared her palette with earth tones and flashes of crimson lake and ultramarine blue. And she looked at him. She saw the way his stance was not one of idle posing, but of readiness, his weight perfectly balanced. She saw the strength in his hands, the knuckles scarred, the fingers long and capable. She saw the intelligence in those gray eyes, a cold, calculating mind that was far more dangerous than mere brute strength. But as she began to sketch, blocking in the basic forms with charcoal, she also saw the shadows. The weariness at the corners of his eyes, a faint tension in his jaw that spoke of old pains, physical and otherwise, a solitude that clung to him like a second skin. He was a man who commanded thousands, yet in the quiet of her studio, he seemed utterly alone. And Elisabetta, the artist, the observer, felt a dangerous, unwelcome stirring of something that was not fear nor pity, but a profound and unsettling curiosity. The days settled into a strange, new rhythm. Orsini came every afternoon, punctual as the cathedral bell. He would arrive, often with a faint scent of horse, leather, and cold air clinging to him, shed his cloak and sword belt without a word, and take his position by the window. Conversation was sparse, functional. Turn your head slightly to the left. The light is changing. Your hand, relax it. He was a difficult subject, not because he was impatient, but because he was too still, too controlled. He presented a facade of polished marble, and Elisabetta found herself struggling to chip through to the man beneath. The portrait taking shape on the panel was technically proficient, a masterful rendering of a powerful condottiere. But it was a lie. It was the man the Signoria wanted to see, not the man she was beginning to perceive. Frustration gnawed at her. One afternoon, after a particularly fruitless hour where every stroke fell dead, she put down her brush with a sharp click. "You are holding your breath," she said. He blinked, the first break in his statue-like composure in over an hour. "What?" "When you stand like that, at attention, you hold your breath. It makes you look like a statue in a niche. It is not how a man stands. It is how a monument stands." His gray eyes narrowed. "I'm a soldier. I know how to stand. You know how to stand for inspection. I need you to stand for a portrait. There is a difference." She walked over to him, the space between them suddenly feeling charged. "Breathe. Let your shoulders drop. A man who has seen battle does not carry himself with the stiff posture of a palace guard. He carries his history in his bones. Show me that." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then almost imperceptibly his stance shifted. His shoulders lost their rigid line. His hand on the sword pommel loosened from a grip to a rest. He took a slow, deep breath, and as he did, the entire character of his presence changed. The power was still there, but it was the relaxed, confident power of a predator at rest, not a soldier on parade. The weariness she had only glimpsed before became more pronounced, and with it, a startling humanity. "Better," she whispered, her heart thudding strangely against her ribs. She retreated to her easel, and her charcoal flew across the panel with a new urgency. This was it. This was the truth. After that, a fragile, unspoken truce formed between them. The silence became less hostile, more contemplative. He began to ask questions. "Why that color?" he asked one day, watching her mix a peculiar gray for the shadow under his chin. "It is not just black and white," she explained, her focus on the palette. "There is blue in the shadow, from the sky, and a touch of the red from your doublet. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is reflected, connected." He was silent for a while. "A tactical observation," he murmured. "The terrain always affects the unit." She almost smiled. "Yes, I suppose it does." On another occasion, he gestured with his chin towards the Magdalene, now placed in a corner. You gave her the hands of a peasant." Elisabetta paused, surprised he had noticed such a detail. "She was, according to some texts, a woman of means, but I believe her faith was not a quiet, gentle thing. It was earned. It came through despair and hard labor of the spirit. Rough hands seemed appropriate." "You think spirit has a labor?" he asked, his tone neutral. "I think anything of value requires labor," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "Do you not find that in your profession?" "My profession deals in the labor of flesh and steel. The spirit is a luxury most soldiers cannot afford. Or perhaps it is the only thing that keeps them human," she countered softly. He did not reply, but his gaze remained on her for a long time, thoughtful and heavy. The turning point came on a day of unseasonable rain. It lashed against the windows of the studio, and the light was a dim, watery gray. Orsini was restless, his mind clearly on the maneuvers the weather was disrupting. Elisabetta, frustrated with the poor light, decided to work on the background, a view of Florence through a fictive archway. "You have captured the Duomo perfectly," he observed, coming to stand behind her to look at the panel. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the rain on his woolen tunic. His sudden proximity sent a jolt through her, a confusing mix of alarm and something else, something warmer. "It is just a sketch," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "No, it is more than that. You have given the city life. It is not just buildings. It is a living entity." He paused, and his voice, when he spoke next, was quieter, almost intimate. "You see the world differently. You see the life in things." He was standing so close his shoulder almost brushed hers. She could see the individual threads of his doublet, the pulse at the base of his throat. Her eyes were drawn to the scar on his brow. Without thinking, driven by an impulse she did not understand, she reached out. Her fingers, stained with charcoal and umber, gently touched the pale line on his skin. He went perfectly still. The air in the room vanished. The only sound was the drumming of the rain. "How did you get this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. His gray eyes were dark, the pupils wide. He did not move away. "A disagreement. Near Ravenna. A man with a broken bottle. He was faster than I anticipated." "What happened to him?" "I was faster with a dagger." The reply was flat, factual, but his eyes were burning into hers. Her fingertips still rested on his skin, on the history of his violence. It should have repelled her, but all she felt was a devastating, terrifying heat spreading from the point of contact, coursing through her veins. She saw his chest rise and fall with a sharp breath. She saw his gaze drop to her lips. The moment stretched, taut and fragile as a spider's silk. The world had shrunk to this. The rain, the scent of him, the feel of his scar beneath her fingers, and the terrifying, undeniable pull between them. Slowly, as if moving against a great weight, she lowered her hand. The spell was broken, but the air remained charged, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. "We should stop for today," she managed to say, turning away from him to hide the flush on her cheeks. "The light is gone." "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough. He did not move for a long moment. Then she heard the rustle of his clothes as he retrieved his cloak. He left without another word. When the door closed behind him, Elisabetta sank onto a stool, her legs trembling. She looked at the portrait. The man on the panel was no longer just a condottiere. He was Valerio, and she, Elisabetta Morelli, a woman of respectable birth and a promising career, was in grave, scandalous, intoxicating danger. The affair began not with a declaration, but with a silent, mutual surrender. It was in the looks that lasted a heartbeat too long, in the accidental brush of a hand as she passed him a cup of wine, in the charged silence that filled the studio when they spoke of everything but the thing that consumed them. Elisabetta knew the rules. She knew the price a woman paid for such a transgression: ruin, exile, the cloister. Her reputation, her hard-won career would be ashes. And he was a mercenary, a man of violence, a man passing through. There was no future in it. It was madness. Yet, when he arrived the next day, the madness felt like the only sane thing in the world. He stood again by the window, but the pretense of work was a thin veil. She picked up her brush, but her hand was unsteady. She was trying to mix the exact shade of his gray eyes, a color she now saw in her dreams. "I cannot paint today," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense quiet. Her heart plummeted. This was it. He had come to his senses. He would end this before it began. "I see," she said, her voice tight. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping before her easel. He did not look at the painting. He looked only at her. "I've spent my life reading battlefields, calculating odds, assessing risks. I know the moment to charge and the moment to retreat. But here, in this room, with you, my logic has deserted me." "Captain Orsini," she began, a feeble attempt at propriety. "Valerio," he interrupted, his voice low and intense. "My name is Valerio, and you, Elisabetta, are the most disarming thing I have ever encountered." He reached out, not to touch her face, but to gently take the brush from her trembling fingers. He laid it carefully on the easel ledge. The gesture was unbearably intimate. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered, even as she leaned into the space he was inviting her into. "It is a catastrophic one," he agreed, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was calloused, but infinitely gentle. "But it is the only one that feels true." And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a confession, a release of all the pent-up tension of the past weeks. It was the taste of desperation and wonder, of steel and sunlight. Her hands came up to clutch at his doublet, not to push him away, but to anchor herself against the tidal wave of feeling that crashed over her. The world, with all its conventions and consequences, fell away. There was only the heat of his mouth, the solid strength of his body against hers, and the shocking, glorious rightness of it. From that day on, the studio became their secret world. The portrait became their alibi. Signor Lombardi would visit, clucking approvingly at the progress, seeing only the masterwork taking shape, blind to the deeper, more dangerous masterpiece unfolding in the shadows. The sessions would begin with painting, but often the brushes would be forgotten, the paints left to skin over as they lost themselves in each other. He told her things in those stolen hours, things she knew he told no one else. The boy from a minor noble family who took up the sword because it was the only path to real power. The first man he killed, and the nightmares that followed. The weight of command, the loneliness of being the one who always had to have the answer. She, in turn, told him of her struggles, of the condescension of the male artists, of her father's disappointment that she had not married well, of her dream to be remembered not as a woman who painted, but as a painter, He was not the wolf of the Apennines in her arms. He was Valerio, a man of startling vulnerability and dry wit. He would trace the lines of her face as if memorizing them for a map. "You have battlefields in your soul, Elisabetta," he once said, "more than I have ever conquered." The portrait flourished. It was no longer just a likeness. It was a revelation. She had captured the condottiere's power, but also his isolation, his intelligence, and a flicker of the humanity she alone was permitted to see. It was her masterpiece because it was a portrait of the man she loved. But Florence was a city of sharp eyes and sharper tongues. A condottiere and a female painter spending hours alone behind a closed door was a story too succulent not to be told. Whispers began to slither through the cobbled streets, from the market stalls to the grand palazzos. They reached the ears of the signoria, who were less concerned with morality than with stability. A scandal could unsettle their expensive mercenary, and they reached the ears of a man who saw an opportunity. Carlo Morelli, Elisabetta's cousin and her father's heir, was a man of impeccable respectability and profound avarice. He had always viewed Elisabetta's career as an eccentricity at best, an embarrassment at worst. The whispers were a gift. With her ruined, he could seize the small but valuable property her studio was in, sell her materials, and be rid of the stain on the family name. And if he could leverage the scandal to gain favor with the powerful, all the better. The storm broke on a bright, cold morning. Elisabetta was in the studio, alone, adding a glaze to the crimson shadow of Valerio's cloak. The door burst open. Not Valerio, but her cousin Carlo, her father, his face a mask of fury and shame, and two stern-faced members of the city guard. "Elisabetta Morelli," Carlo announced, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "Your depravity is known. Your association with that mercenary has brought disgrace upon our house." Her father would not look at her. "It is over, girl. You will come home. This place is sealed. The painting will be confiscated. Perhaps it can still be of some use to the signoria if finished by a proper hand." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. They were taking it all. Her work, her freedom, her sanctuary. "You have no right," she cried. "The commission is mine." "You have forfeited all rights," her father roared, finally meeting her eyes, his own filled with a bitter disappointment that hurt more than his anger. "You chose to behave like a common whore." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. As the guards moved to take the painting, Elisabetta threw herself in front of it, a desperate, futile gesture. It was in that moment of chaos that Valerio arrived. He filled the doorway, his presence sucking all the air from the room. His face was a calm mask, but his gray eyes were like chips of glacial ice. He took in the scene in an instant. Elisabetta's distress, the hostile men, the threat to the painting. "Explain this," he said. The quiet command in his voice was more terrifying than any shout. Carlo, emboldened by the presence of the guard, puffed out his chest. "Captain Orsini, we are here to remedy the situation. My cousin's reputation is compromised. Your association must end. We are taking her and the painting." Valerio took a single step into the room. The two guards, professional soldiers themselves, instinctively took a step back. "You will touch neither," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "The lady is under my protection. The painting is my commission. You will leave. Now. You have no authority here. Carlos Plated. This is a matter of family and Florentine law." Valerio's smile was a cold, sharp thing. "I am a law that Florence pays for, and I am telling you that if you do not remove yourself from my sight and from the presence of this woman, I will introduce you to a different kind of authority, the kind that leaves men broken in the street." He didn't draw his sword. He didn't need to. The promise of violence was in the air, as tangible as the smell of paint. Carlo Paled. Elisabetta's father looked old and defeated. The guards looked at each other, clearly unwilling to engage the infamous wolf of the Apennines over a domestic squabble. With a final, venomous look, Carlo ushered his father out, the guards following sheepishly. The door closed, leaving Elisabetta and Valerio alone in the sudden, ringing silence. She was trembling, the adrenaline draining away to leave a hollow fear. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her ear. "It is done," she whispered, tears finally coming. "My reputation, my career." "To hell with your reputation," he murmured into her hair. "Your career is not over. It is just beginning." He held her at arm's length, his hands firm on her shoulders. "Elisabetta, this changes nothing for me. Everything. I have spent my life acquiring things, land, title, wealth. But you're the only thing that has ever felt like a victory. Come with me." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "My contract with Florence is up in a month. I have offers from Milan, from Venice. Come with me. Be my wife." The word, wife, echoed in the studio. It was an impossible solution, a fantasy. "Your wife?" "Valerio, you are a nobleman. I'm a painter." "You are Elisabetta Morelli," he said with fierce conviction. "The woman who stared down the devil and taught him how to feel. Let them have their whispers. Let them have their empty city. We will have a different world." He looked at the portrait, then back at her. "Finish it. Finish my portrait. Not for them. For us. Show them the man you see. And then we leave this place behind." In his eyes, she saw not an ending, but a terrifying, glorious beginning. The scandal was here, but her future was with him. It was a choice between the life she knew and a life of unimaginable risk. Looking at him, feeling the solid reality of his love, the choice was no choice at all. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I will come with you." The final month in Florence was a study in tension and quiet rebellion. The scandal raged in drawing rooms and piazzas, but Elisabetta, shielded by Valerio's formidable presence, became impervious to it. She finished the portrait. She worked with a new, ferocious purpose. Every stroke was a defiance, every glaze a declaration. She painted the wolf of the Apennines, the strategist, the leader. But she also painted the man who had kissed her in the rain, the man who saw the battlefields in her soul. The painting was a masterpiece because it was, in its entirety, a love letter. The day of its unveiling at the Palazzo Vecchio was a spectacle. The great hall was filled with the most powerful men in Florence, their faces a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and grudging respect. Signor Lombardi was there, sweating profusely. Carlo and her father stood to one side, their expression sour. When the velvet cloth was drawn back, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The portrait was stunning. Valerio Orsini stood, not as a brute, but as a Renaissance prince of war. The power was undeniable, but so was the intelligence in his gray eyes, the hint of weariness, the subtle humanity that made him seem both formidable and, strangely, trustworthy. It was the portrait of a man you would follow in a battle, and a man you would fear to have as an enemy. It was exactly what the Signoria needed, and it was everything they feared. It was a triumph. Even her detractors were silenced by the sheer genius of the work. In that moment, Elisabetta Morelli, the scandalous female painter, was undeniable. She did not stay for the celebrations. As the lords of Florence clustered around the painting, she slipped away. Valerio was waiting for her by the Ponte Vecchio, his personal guard discreetly nearby. He had shed his formal wear for traveling clothes. 2 horses were saddled and ready. He held out his hand. She took it, her own hand still faintly stained with crimson lake and ultramarine. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes soft. She took one last look at the city of her birth, its towers glowing in the setting sun. It was the city that had tried to constrain her, and the city that had, in its own way, given her the subject of her greatest work and the love of her life. "I am ready," she said. He helped her onto her horse, and they rode east towards the Apennines, towards Milan, towards an unwritten future. The scandal would fade in Florence, becoming just another story. But the portrait would remain, a testament to the artist who had dared to look upon the wolf and see the man. and in doing so, had found her own freedom. She was no longer just Elisabetta Morelli, the painter. She was Elisabetta, who loved Valerio Orsini. And as they disappeared into the gathering dusk, the crimson shadow of their shared destiny stretched out behind them, long and brave and full of light.